Well, thank you for staying. Welcome to a good late afternoon. I know it's been an incredibly stimulating day. I hardly have a single brain cell left myself. Yeah, my name is Michael Fix, and I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute, and I'm used to standing up here and talking about why we should consider providing legal status to 5 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, which is a slightly less sophisticated conversation than we're going to have right now. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I just really want to thank our friends and colleagues at AIR. I want to thank Steve Reeder. I want to thank the department for the opportunity to really look at PIAAC and try to figure out what the competencies of first-generation immigrants and to a somewhat lesser degree second-generation immigrants, that is to say, the U.S.-born children of foreign-born adults. I want to thank you for this package that you put together for us, for the training, for the access to the data, and I really want to thank you for the 18 pages of penetrating and difficult to respond to comments that we got on a 30-page paper. Oh, I want to change. All right, so what I'm going to do, we're going to do is we're going to say a few words about the imperatives for the study, our research questions, our findings, and as we were bidden to do, their implications for future research and for public policy. You know this, there's an obvious and simple demographic imperative for this work in particular. You see the immigrant population quadrupling between 1970 and 2013 from 10 to 40 million people. It keeps Michael Jones jumping. 1 in 8 U.S. residents is an immigrant, but immigrants are, as you know, overrepresented in the labor force. They're 1 in 6 workers in the U.S. labor force. This presence is reflected in the PIAAC sample. About 15% of the sample from 15 to 65 is foreign-born, and about 9% of the sample is second-generation U.S.-born adults with 1 or more immigrant parents. From a policy perspective, we assume that virtually all net growth in workers will come from immigrant populations who will be the workers who were walking through the door to a new and perhaps reviving economy as older workers, like the speaker here, retires. Now another imperative for the work, and this is also something of a finding, lies in the fact that immigrants have been so widely reported to be overrepresented among adults with low skills in the PIAAC. So while they're 15% of the PIAAC sample, they're 33% of adults with low English literacy, and they're 24% of adults in the sample with low numeracy. And here I should do a little definitional work. When we talk about the PIAAC results, we are, of course, talking about English language literacy and numeracy in English. By low proficiency, I hardly need to tell you guys this, we refer to those who are taking the test who scored below level 2 and thus below 225 out of a potential 500 points. We consider the highly proficient to be those scoring at levels 3 or higher and above 276 points on literacy and numeracy. And by immigrants, we mean individuals born abroad, and by the second generation, I mean U.S.-born adults with 1 or more foreign-born parents. All right, that should be the end of the worst part. Keep going. So we started with a number of research questions with what is admittedly an essentially descriptive study of the first generation and to a lesser degree of the second generation. We'll be pursuing the second generation in more depth later on. These research questions that I'm going to run through lie at the intersection, and why they're so interesting to us, they lie at the intersection of the immigrant integration, labor force, education, and immigration selection literatures. So really it's a great opportunity for us, and they include how do the skills of immigrants and natives compare? How do immigrant skills vary across generations from the first to the 1.5, that is to say immigrants who came before they were 13, to the second generation? What is the degree to which the U.S.'s low overall skills that we've been hearing about all day can be laid at the doorstep of the immigrants taking the PIAAC? How do immigrant skills vary by place of education? And by extension, to what extent do they explain the underemployment that Jeanne and I see and that we study among highly educated immigrants, particularly those who've been educated abroad? And how do respondents' tested skills, this nice thing, these direct tests of literacy, numeracy, and if you will, computer skills, correlate to self-reported spoken language proficiency? This is a very important question as we try to think about English language learners and what the right practices and programs for them might be. And how do immigrant skills relate to their labor market access, whether they get jobs, and to their incomes, and how do those compare in turn to natives? And finally, we asked, and we'll answer if you want to ask us, about how representative the immigrant sample in the PIAAC seems when we compare it to larger immigrant samples in the ACS or in the CPS. All right, so now to a few findings. And this slide tells our main, and I would argue, somewhat distressing story. When compared to the reasonably lackluster scores of the U.S. born in total, immigrants basically fared worse. The average literacy, if you see in the box on the right, the average literacy and numeracy scores, we see a 35-point gap between immigrants and natives for English literacy, and we see a somewhat narrower 24-point gap for numeracy. If you look to the bars and to proficiency levels, what you see is that only 28% of the foreign-born can be considered to be proficient in literacy and 24% in numeracy. If we look to problem solving in a technology-rich environment, poster I have learned, here again what we see is a 24-point gap, but we also see that a very small share of both the U.S. born and the immigrant populations are proficient. So I'll just end my part of this presentation with the answer to a question that Jeanne and I were asking ourselves about midway through developing this paper, and that is, to what extent are low overall U.S. scores to the PIAAC ascribable to immigrants? And our undramatic but quite politically relevant answer is not too much. If we remove the foreign-born from the national average, what we see is a simple 5-point decline in literacy from 275 to 270. But as you'll hear in Jeanne's presentation, gaps between the first generation and the second generation natives, these gaps between the first generation immigrants and natives essentially disappear when we look at the changes by the second generation, because the second generation, as you'll see, second generation adults have the same level of results as U.S. born adults. So in some ways, the deep interesting theme, the deep political theme is to some extent an intergenerational progress. So with that, let me turn the computer over to my more capable colleague, Jeanne Batalova, and we'll
see if I am indeed more capable. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, and I'm really delighted to be here to present our results. And the first one is that skills vary greatly by race and ethnicity and/or immigrant status. So I would like to highlight 3 findings on this chart. Number 1 is that regardless of nativity, whites and Asians outscore their Black and Hispanic counterparts. Number 2, proficiency levels of white immigrants are essentially the same as their native-born counterparts, and the same story holds for Black immigrant and natives. However, if we look at the Hispanics and Asians, nativity matters. Native-born adults were substantially less likely to score at low-skilled levels than their immigrant counterparts. So let's see if this works. Yay. Okay, so 62% of foreign-born Hispanics scored below level 2, which is below basic, and that share drops significantly to 24% when we look at the Hispanic natives. And as Michael mentioned, we see that as a sign of intergenerational progress, to which I'll get back to a bit later. All right. So let's take a look at the difference in proficiency levels by age and immigrant status. And we already heard earlier that there isn't much difference between very young, kind of the entering into the labor market cohort population and the soon-to-retire population. And we do see that, indeed, the percentage of adults who scored proficient on English literacy among the 16 to 26 is very similar to the 55 to 65 group for the natives. However, that there is a significant gap between the younger and the older groups among immigrants, which suggests some improvement in the skills of the labor force replacement population among immigrants, although I do have to point out that that the share of 30% is significantly lower than for the similar natives. So since the PIAAC assessment is essentially a test in English literacy and numeracy, one might predict that recently arriving immigrants will have lower skills in English than those who've lived in the country for a while, because they would have greater exposure to English. And let me bust this myth or this assumption with our finding of known finding, that the averages across all periods of arrivals were pretty much the same. They're no statistically different. And there are possibly a lot of reasons, but one possible explanation that we looked at is the higher share of advanced degree college graduates among the later arriving immigrants. So we have 24% among those who arrived since 2007, compared to half that share in the earlier arriving groups. So of course 2007 and later coincided with the Great Recession and the post-recession recovery. So the factors such as tighter U.S. labor market, a corresponding decline in the flow of unauthorized migration is likely contributed to the rise in human capital of post-recession migration flows to the United States, and perhaps that can explain this lack of funding. As a number of presenters before me demonstrated already, is that there is education and competencies are strongly correlated, and we find that the differences across education are statistically significant for both immigrant and native adults. I would like to draw your attention to three findings here. Well, number one is that regardless of nativity, adults with the so-called middle range educational attainments, so between high school degree and associate degree, are not reaching proficiency on average. So their scores are below the proficient cut score. Number two, there is a large gap between immigrants and natives across all levels of education. 5 minutes. But this gap narrows for those with advanced degrees. So education matters, but so does place of education. We find that in PIAAC data, 59% of college-educated immigrants earn their degrees in the United States, which is a good news because research demonstrates that having a U.S. degree boosts immigrants' opportunities for better employment and higher wages. So we see, what we see here is that there is a significant improvement in scores between those who earn degrees abroad, in the U.S. versus those who earned abroad in both numeracy and literacy, and there is virtually no difference, or at least the small difference between the U.S.-educated natives and U.S.-educated immigrants. So quickly on the second generation story, we have a good and a bad news here, and the good news is that there is a steady progression in so the share of those with low skills drops across generations, and the share of those with higher proficiency rises across generation. The not so good story is that even the second generation catches up to the third generation in terms of their scores. Both groups' proficiency levels are low compared to other OECD countries. I'm going to skip this slide, even though it's very important, and I can go back to it later. But economic outcomes matter a great deal to policy and practitioners, so let's look at those. What we find is that higher literacy and numeracy skills meant improved employment opportunities for natives, but not for immigrants, because immigrants, regardless of their skills levels, were able to find a job. Unlike employment, higher literacy and numeracy skills mattered a great deal for both immigrants and natives. Adults who were proficient on average earned $36,000 more per year than their low-skilled counterparts. That's a big difference. And number three is that for immigrants to be paid well and on par with natives, they absolutely need to have higher levels of English skill competencies. I'm going to also skip this very important slide for the methodology wonks among us because I ran out of time, but I would like to highlight a few policy implications of our findings. Number one is that we found that immigrants have very high levels of employment, which means that workplace could be an ideal place for them to obtain additional training, not only because it contextualizes the skills, but also because it removes logistical hurdles associated with taking classes in a regular, in a college or on campus. The other finding is that a significant share of both bachelor and graduate level, college-educated immigrants with bachelor and college and advanced degrees among immigrants scored below proficient in English, which to us means that there is a significant need to provide language support across all educational levels, not only for low-skilled. And we think that a number of our findings will be relevant for the recently created White House task on new Americans, which basically is an intergovernment agency effort to identify and support state and local policies and programs aimed at immigrant integration across various dimensions, workforce and education including. And the last finding, the last policy implication I'd like to highlight is that I didn't cover that in my presentation, but one of the things we looked at is how in research and policy we define limited English proficient population. It's defined as those who speak English less than very well. However, when we look at kind of individual subcategories within this population, we find a substantial heterogeneity in this population, and which implies that there is there are wide divergent needs for this population, which has implications for both funding and program development that will serve these populations. Zero.